Welcome to the Cash Stream Financials video, an introduction to acquisition finance. In this video we will explore the different structures of acquisition and how acquisition finance fits into the process. My name is Tim Lee and I'm the CEO and founder of Cash Stream Financial, specialists in raising working capital finance. You might be interested to know that this video is part of a series of videos relating to commercial finance which are available to view in the Learning Centre of our website, cashstream.com.au. In terms of debt structures for debt funding, two structures exist. The first is a multiple of EBITDA. EBITDA is considered as a proxy for cash flow, as this takes into account depreciation and amortization, which are not actually cash items. The second structure is asset-based lending. Under the EBITDA multiple model, the banks would traditionally fund at a multiple of EBITDA. At the peak of the market, banks were funding up to 7 times EBITDA, where private equity institutions were involved. Be aware the credit crunch has reduced this dramatically. Banks can look at up to 3 times EBITDA, but it's unlikely the banks will fund using this method below $3 million. They are also very cautious in the current climate. Bankers will also need to see at least 20 to 25% of the purchase price being funded by your equity. If we look at the second structure for debt funding, asset-based lending. Under this structure of funding, different assets and classes can be quite aggressively funded by debt. For example, real estate up to 70% valuation, plant and equipment up to 85%, debtors up to 90%, and inventory up to 60%. But these look at realizable values, not market value. So buyers may need to pay the difference between bank value and the fair market value of the assets. Now, with a clever use of vendor finance, in other words deferred payment, plus asset-based lending, it is possible in the right circumstance to fund an acquisition using 100% debt. Although the climate currently is cautious, it is possible if the structure is right. So let's have a look and see how these work, because the power of acquisition funding is if we explore both methods against your existing business and that of your target. So, for example, let's take your own company's EBITDA performance. We'll assume it's 1.5 million EBITDA. We take the target company's EBITDA performance. We'll assume it's $1 million. The lender combines those two performances together, in other words $2.5 million, and then evaluates a facility typically up to $7.5 million. Now the same principle applies to asset-based lending. So if your company and the target company are asset rich, it may be worth considering that structure. Now a question we get asked regularly is, when should you get a debt funder involved? The simple answer is as early as possible, as we can see by the enclosed timeline. An acquisition can be quick if all parties are motivated, but as we can see there are many hurdles within the process, and as a result of these hurdles often the deal is continually changing shape. So it's best to get the lender on board as early and as quickly as possible so that they can change their funding structure. Whilst it may seem obvious for a deal to work, the source of funds needs to be greater than the use of funds, and there needs to be sufficient working capital to take the combined business forward. The sources of funds would typically include any debt that you raise against assets or EBITDA, any vendor finance that you've been able to negotiate, and any equity being used. The use of funds would typically be the purchase price, any overdue creditors that might need to be paid off, legal expenses, and working capital going forward. Be very mindful that legal expenses can be quite high. So in summary, when assessing acquisition finance, you need to ask yourselves the key questions. Is your acquisition a share purchase or an asset purchase? How is the goodwill being funded? How will you fund the difference between the banker's view of assets and the market value? Can you negotiate vendor finance? And the source of your funds needs to exceed the use of your funds.